Hello and welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I go back to look at the life, conquests, character, and legacy of the infamous 14th century warlord known to history as Timur, Tamerlane, or simply Timur. Through this series, we have seen the historical and political background leading to the birth of Timur. We examined his birth and early life, discussing how there's not too much we know about this period, but then we saw Timur become a young man and try twice to gain control of his tribe, the Barlas clan, and also of his home city, the Green City, the city of Kesh. And both times, unfortunately for Timur, both times ended in defeat and humiliation. The second failure especially was hard to endure. For the Moghul invaders who were occupying the region of Transoxiana, or Mawarnar, Timur's homeland, ran him out, exiled him possibly with the threat of death. And so Timur was forced to flee into the desert, in the west the Karakum Desert. His hope was to link up with his brother-in-law, Amir Hussein, who was also a refugee fleeing the Moghuls, and once they are together, just maybe they could mount some sort of coup attempt, or at least have better chances to survive. And this did work out at first, as the two men and their 60 or so followers were able to beat off a contingent of soldiers from the city of Khiva, but this came at a tall price, and as we saw last week, the two men and their handful of followers were captured by a regional warlord named Ali Beg. They were separated and thrown into dungeons. And so when we last left Timur, he was alone, humiliated, and trapped in a vermin-ridden prison. And I apologize for the noises coming from upstairs. Apparently my neighbors up there decided that this would be a perfect time to hold a tap dancing party with 60,000 people. So if you hear noises, just pretend we're on an old 18th century Spanish galleon as I'm telling you this story. Anyway, this is part 2 of what I have dubbed the desert years of Timur's life. That is, the years between 1363 and 1365. This episode will conclude this period of time, but like I said last week, okay, here's the thing. We just don't really know too much about what happened during this time period. In fact, as I've found, most modern histories of Timur skip over this time period entirely, or just give it a paragraph or two. But I don't want to do that, so at the end of this episode, we'll talk about what we know for sure happened to Timur during these desert years, what historians today all accept, but before then, we're going to look at some of these stories that our primary sources give us. Now, these stories very well could be true, or maybe mostly true, and I've included them because I think they're important regardless of whether or not they happened the exact way the chronicles tell us. But this is my roundabout way of saying that some aspects of what you are about to hear may not have happened, and they're probably impossible to verify. But okay, that aside, let's get into this. Timur is in prison. Either in prison or a dung-filled cowshed, depending on the source, but I think prison probably makes the most sense, especially because he is here for weeks. The Zafarnama, or Book of Victories as that means, a biography of Timur written 20 or 25 years after his death, is one of our best sources on Timur's life. And the Zafarnama describes this prison with a wonderful line. It says this, I really love how this book is written, but the Zafarnama says, "The prison was a dark chamber, the furniture of which was very mean, and it was so very nasty that there was no living here." But of course, just because Timur was in prison awaiting possible slavery or execution or who knows what, this didn't mean that word of him and his brother-in-law Hussein wasn't spreading. For after all, Timur had been governor of Kesh. He had been spared by Khan Tughlaq Timur of the Moghuls. He had defeated a Kievan army. He was starting to become a bit of a local legend. And as for Hussein, well, everybody knew who Hussein was. He was more famous than Timur. His grandfather had been Amir Khazagan of Transoxiana, and Hussein was ruler of Kabul and parts of Afghanistan. Or he had been before he too was defeated and forced to flee. But he's still out there with Timur. These two guys are still alive, and somehow they're defeating armies. But they're still alive. And one of the people who heard these rumors, who heard these stories of Timur and Hussein still being out there, was a man named Mehmed, who happened to be the brother of Ali Beg, the person who had imprisoned Timur and Hussein's party. And so Mehmed, for some reason or another, wrote to his brother and pleaded to him to free the prisoners. The Zafarnama claims it's because Mehmed was a just man, and he saw this as an unjust act, which could be. But also, Timur and Hussein were popular men. If they were ever to gain power, they'd remember who had helped them to achieve that. So Mehmed pleaded with his brother and sent lavish gifts to him as well. But according to our sources, it took weeks of this before Ali Beg finally gave in and saw the wisdom in his brother's request. So Timur, Hussein, Al-Jai, and their small band of followers were set free. But only after they had been imprisoned for 62 days. And then to add insult to injury, Ali Beg gives the party only one dying horse and an old camel to get them on their journey. But hey, at least they were free. And luck soon smiled on them once again, for an old friend of Timur and Timur's family, a man that the Zafarnama calls Mubarak Shah, Prince of Sandgir, heard of their troubles and hastened to them, giving their party horses to ride and enough supplies to last them a while. And this might sound a bit odd and random, but we'll get to why encounters like this make sense in just a moment. But before that, Timur and Hussein now found themselves in a bit of a problematic situation. They're alive, which is good. They're free, this is also good. But what the hell do they do next? What are they even trying to do? Well, with the gift of hindsight, it's pretty easy for us to guess their motive. They're both trying to regain power of the peoples and places that were taken from them by the Moghuls. So at some point, they have to take on the Moghuls in order to free Transoxiana, or Mawarnar as it's sometimes called. And indeed, the two men may have even secretly formed a secret pact to devote their lives to ousting the Moghuls from their lands. So we know what they're trying to do, but how on earth do they actually accomplish that? They're in a foreign land, which is free from the Moghuls, sure, but this also means that none of their former subjects, none of their tribesmen who know them are anywhere nearby. And the natives of this foreign land likely aren't going to jump up to volunteer to assist these guys, at least not yet. But they need to do something soon, because as we've seen, people are out to get them, either Moghuls or others who want to sell them to the Moghuls. So the two men sit down and make a plan. First, they would split up again for the time being, because it seems that their enemies have had a much easier time tracking them down when they're together. And hey, the first time they split up worked, so let's try that again. But they also need an army and the funds to support an army. Because now they have maybe a few dozen guys, maybe as many as 300, but certainly not anything they can hope to liberate their homelands with. Well, they decide that part 2 of their plan would be for both of them to go to their separate homes, Hussein back to northwestern Afghanistan and Timur to Mawarnar. This would mean that they would have to somehow avoid whatever Moghuls or Mughal allies were there, but they would be in a place where people knew them and would be more likely to join their forces. And then part 3 was to regroup somewhere to the west out of Mughal territory in order to combine their forces together, see what finances they have and whatnot before finally launching all that build-up and then I stumble. Launching the reconquest of Transoxiana. So off they go, with Timur returning to an occupied home where he has been deemed an enemy. But to return to Mawarnar, or Transoxiana, one has to cross the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River. For of course, Mawarnar was the land beyond the river, that being the Amu Darya River. And to cross the Amu Darya, one could either go to the fords and crossings that would likely be full of merchants and travelers, and possibly Mughal scouts, or one could cross the river at a place where there was no natural or man-made crossing. Although this would be more dangerous, of course, but Timur chose the second of these two options. He waited on the banks of the river for several weeks to allow his followers and his animals time to rest, but then the time came for him to cross the dangerous river. And this is probably one of those events that likely happened, as several sources, both pro-Timur sources and anti-Timur sources, both mention Timur's famous crossing of the Amu Darya. The Zafarnama quickly explains that the crossing was dangerous and difficult, but that everybody made it across safely. Quaint and fine, but it's our source written by Arab Shah, a very anti-Timur source that really brings this scene to life. Arab Shah sets up the stage by explaining that Timur's small party had actually been spotted by enemy scouts, who were bearing down on them, forcing Timur's party to hastily flee across the river. Arab Shah goes on and says, "Their pursuers were ruthless. Timur therefore bade his men with all speed hurl themselves into the water, each holding the bridle and mane of his horse. And they arranged a place among themselves. And Timur said, 'Cross without delay, and everyone who does not come to the appointed place will know that it is finished with him.' Then they threw themselves and their horses into the rearing waters and swelling waves, like moths towards a lamp. Nor did one care for another's plight, or the man in front watch the fate of the man behind, and they endured the tortures of death and saw openly the terrors of destruction. Now that's an exciting description, and even Arab Shah, a guy who hates every fiber in Timur's body, even he admits that this crossing was marvelous, and our sources agree that not a single man was lost. And the good news was that now Timur was back home in Mawarnar, or Transoxiana. But the bad news is that the enemy, the occupying Moghuls, are still here, and they're still keeping an eye out for him. We don't know much about this mission once Timur was here in Mawarnar. He apparently stayed with his sister, the Princess Kodluk Turkan, for some time, possibly for as much as 48 days, but then he was forced to flee her home once the Moghuls heard he was hiding there. So he traveled back to the region near Kesh, his home city, secretly recruiting what men would follow him, but also simply spreading the word that he was alive and that there was still resistance out there. Resistance against the wretched, hated Moghuls. But other than this, we just don't know too much more, other than it appears that this part of the plan was a success. For Timur then left Mawarnar with his followers and regrouped with Hussein at the designated rendezvous point, a place called Hermen. And they had accomplished what they set out to do. They now had a small band of warriors behind them, possibly as many as 1,000 men. And this was certainly not enough to take back their homelands with, but it was a start. And at least they didn't have to worry about being caught by 60 horsemen like they had just a few months prior. But soldiers, their followers, and who knows how many horses are expensive. Timur and Hussein need money. Thankfully, though, they were now essentially mercenary captains with a horde of warriors at their command. And look, wars in the area were not hard to find. And as such, somewhere along here, Timur and Hussein get word that a prince of Sistan is planning to invade some of his neighbors, and he's eagerly looking for mercenaries willing to join his forces. Now, let's take a moment to actually talk about this province of Sistan, where this prince was located. If you'll remember way back to our episode on the Ilkhanate, or the Ilkhanate, then you might recall how the Khanate collapsed in about the year 1335 due to a combination of losses against the Mamluks in Egypt, a whole lineup of less than mediocre Khans, and then ultimately the destruction brought on by the Black Death. But the year 1335 was quite a while before Timur and Timur's army will come sweeping in from the east. And in the 40 years or so between the fall of the Ilkhanate and the advent of Timur, the former lands of the Ilkhanate were dashed into, maybe 25 or so smaller kingdoms. And as you can imagine, these various kingdoms often fought against one another in hopes of coming out on top. But because there were so many of these petty rivals, and because the populations here were still trying to recover from the Black Death, no one political entity managed to take everything over. And don't worry, we will be looking a lot more into these different factions once Timur's empire actually runs into them, but for now, let's just say that the former Ilkhanate lands were plunged into a period of political upheaval, anarchy, and a vacuum of power. This can be a bit hard to visualize, so I recommend that you hop on over to timurpodcast.com. And ignore how ugly the website is. I know it looks bad. I'm going to try and reformat the entire thing one of these days. But anyway, go to the Maps tab on the top of the screen, and then scroll on down to map number 6. Map number 6 shows the political scene of the former Ilkhanate lands at about the year 1345. And if you look closely, all the way to the right, at the very eastern edge, is the region of Sistan, or Sakistan as it's sometimes called. Today, Sistan would include parts of eastern Iran and western Afghanistan. But if we go back to where we are in the narrative, about 1364 or so, Sistan is one of the many tiny kingdoms trying to make a name for itself by attacking its neighbors in what is this gigantic Persian power vacuum. And as such, it comes as no surprise that the various lords and leaders of Sistan were looking for more troops. And now here are Timur and Hussein with their own war party looking for work. It's the perfect match. And again, Timur and Hussein's time serving the Prince of Sistan is another occurrence that we're fairly certain of. The details might be a bit different here or there, but our sources all mention this mercenary work here. And so, Timur and Hussein join their army with that of the Prince of Sistan in his employment, in his service, and they fight in several of his battles and are generally victorious. But then something happens. Somebody betrayed somebody. and the relationship between the mercenaries and the Prince of Sistan was shattered. The Zafarnama says that the prince was unable or unwilling to pay Timur and Hussein for their services. Another source says that Hussein was unwilling to relinquish strongholds that his men had taken, even though he was in the service of the prince, and these technically weren't his to take. And then another source says that Timur and Hussein used their newfound authority to just sweep through the land, pillaging everything. We just don't know. But the result is that the contract ends, and Timur and Hussein leave to head back north again. And while they're leaving the region of Sistan, they are attacked, either by the prince's soldiers, eager to enact revenge perhaps, or by the locals, angry that Hussein had mistreated them, or maybe it was the army of an enemy of the Prince of Sistan who they'd just previously been fighting. Again, whatever the case, battle ensues, and in this battle, very possibly, this is where Timur is shot with arrows. One pierces his right leg and the other his right arm, leaving Timur forever impacted by these wounds, and leading to his eventual title of Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane as he's often referred to in the West. Now that's all I'm going to say about this, because I have actually prepared an entire separate episode on this subject, and I decided to make it a separate episode because Timur's lameness is possibly the most famous thing about him, oddly enough. And so if people just want to jump in to hear about his lameness, this will make it easier for them to do so. But never fear, there will be more material about this coming soon, possibly tonight if I can finish all the editing. And I'm very excited for this episode. It's got some wild subjects. But anyway, for now, let's just say that Timur recovered from his wounds enough, at least to keep the story moving. The two men, Hussein and Timur, decide to head in the direction of Mawarnar, even though they don't yet have the strength to take it. But then something strange happens. It's actually been happening for a little while now, at least it started, and this is likely the reason why Timur and Hussein decided to start returning. One of my favorite events or themes to find throughout history is when traditional enemies are forced to put aside their differences and become new allies, usually in order to take on a larger threat. The first example of this that just jumps straight to my mind is that during Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul in the 50s BCE. Gaul corresponds more or less to what is today the region of France, the country of France. And living here at the time of Caesar were dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of various tribes and clans of fierce Gallic peoples. And some of these tribes had feuds with other tribes that went back for generations, centuries, to the point that these weren't wars, these were traditions. Every summer we go raid this tribe because that's what our fathers and our grandfathers did. This is just a lifestyle for us. Peace isn't even on the table, this is just how we do things. That tribe exists so that we can kill and enslave them. And that's how we live here in northern Gaul, happily raiding our neighbors all the time. But then word reaches us from far in the south that alien men clothed in metal and fighting as a single body, how they're destroying the entire south. And we brush these off as wild tales at first, but then we hear of another village being destroyed, and then another, and then another. And then an entire tribe is wiped out, and then another tribe, and people are starting to get a bit scared. Because nobody can stop who you and I today know were the Romans. Well, how many faraway villages have to be destroyed? How many hundreds of thousands of fellow Gauls have to be slaughtered before you and I start to think about building up some sort of defensive army? And you know what this means. Your tribe hates my tribe hates yours. Last summer you murdered my brother on a raid, so this spring I stole 20 of your cows. But we're not talking about seasonal raids here, we're talking about the threat of total subjugation. And amazingly, as Caesar gets further and further into the heartland of Gaul, murdering or subduing everybody in front of him, we see this amazing thing happen. The Gauls unite. Dozens and dozens of tribes who hated one another joined together in an alliance because they all realized that this threat was far bigger than any of them. And when these scenarios occur, I've noticed two steps in the pattern. First of all, there has to be a threat that is far more dangerous and far more horrible than any of the peoples who end up allying together despite their differences. Well, Caesar's legions fit this description well. But secondly, there's often a central key figure that everybody is able to rally behind, so that their focus isn't on their new alliance with their old traditional enemies, but now they have something in common, a common enemy and a common hero. And as Roman history tells us, the Gauls rallied behind a great warlord, speaker, and strategist, a man named Vercingetorix, or Vercingetorix. Now yes, the Gauls will end up losing this war, of course, and Gaul will be incorporated into the ever-growing Roman Empire, but they were able to put up way more of a resistance because they put aside their old differences and united. And this is the scenario that fascinates me the most about the story of the Roman conquest of Gaul. And there are many more similar scenarios in history with this same setup. The English take over medieval Scotland through vastly superior military strength, and then they begin to abuse the Scottish people. Well, how on earth do you get dozens of both Highlander and Lowlander tribesmen, people who have hated each other for as long as the Scottish mountains have existed? How on earth do you get them to unite? Well, you tell them that the English control them, and then you give them a figure to rally behind, William Wallace and then Robert the Bruce, and I love these situations in history. Well, if we return to Transoxiana, to Mawarnar, let's look at the situation. Here we have an outside force that is both vastly military superior to the locals, and is also quite horrible to them. This is the occupying Moghuls, the Moghul army. And as our sources tell us, the Moghuls are absolutely horrible to the peoples of Mawarnar. Esteemed Islamic scholars and holy men are being murdered, taxes are being raised through the roof, the soldiers are just taking whatever they want, and as the Zafarnama says, this includes large amounts of young girls to be married to Moghul warriors. And that's a very clean way of saying that this was, of course, not agreed upon by anybody except the Moghuls. And then on top of this daily routine of abuse, the Khan of the Moghuls, Tughlaq Timur, outright murders various tribal leaders whom he saw as troublesome. And we just saw this a few episodes ago. Bayezid Jalir, leader of the Jalir tribe, one of the 6 most powerful tribes in Transoxiana, gone. He's killed. Bayan Saldas, leader of the Saldas tribe, dead. And dozens of others of these important figures gone. Historian Beatrice Manns, one of the best historians, definitely my favorite historian on the age of Timur, she foreshadows what's about to come when describing these executions and these terrors brought on by the Moghuls. She says this: "It was particularly unwise to execute tribal emirs, since Transoxiana operated on a system of collective tribal vengeance." Now, there was no collective tribal anything at the moment. The peoples of Mawarnar were anything but united. We saw this exemplified before the Moghuls were even here. Wars between the various tribes were regular occurrences. There were ever-changing systems of alliances. Emirs were run out if they were deemed too much of a threat to tribal autonomy. Hell, we even saw Timur fighting with his uncle within their own tribe. There were rivalries here that had lasted for generations, but now the Moghuls are here, and they are ruthless. And suddenly, those guys we hated over in the Arlat tribe, suddenly they don't seem quite so bad when compared to the Moghuls. Some tribesmen from the Karaunas clan once stole 2 of your camels, but that Moghul officer, he just stole your daughter. So what we see here is this changing political climate in which the peoples of Transoxiana, regardless of tribe, regardless of lifestyle, they begin to start working together. And whispers of an alliance to push out the Moghuls begin to stir up. This was the first step. The people had this new common enemy that was far more powerful and far more abusive than any of them. Now they just needed a hero, or heroes, to rally behind. And lo and behold, then word reaches us that 2 men we long thought were dead, these 2 guys are alive, and they're coming with an army. Amir Hussein, who had so bravely defied Moghul rule directly, and then lost everything because of it, he is alive, and he's coming back. And with him is Timur, one of our own, Timur who ruled Kesh and the Barlas peoples under the Khan, but then was forced to flee because he disapproved of how the Moghuls ruled us. These are the 2 obvious guys who need to lead us to push out the Moghuls once and for all. So, as such, as Timur and Hussein approach Mawarnar, they see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men from all tribes, from all walks of life, but men who had suffered enough to put aside their traditional differences in order to get together in an attempt to liberate themselves from the Moghul yoke. And so our sources just start listing these guys who start pouring into Timur and Hussein's camp. A tribal leader named Ulam Kuli arrives with 130 horsemen. Mahmut Kili arrives with 100 horsemen and 50 infantrymen. Here's Sadiq Barlas with 15 of his best fighters. Dulan Jun gets here with 300 men. Several Barlas noblemen with him of the same tribe as Timur, who have broken their allegiance with the Moghuls to go and join Timur and Hussein. Some people join who aren't even from Transoxiana, but they just see how talented the two brothers are and figure, hey, this might lead to something great. And the men just keep trickling in. The Zafarnama, or Book of Victories, gives us another exciting instance in which Timur is out scouting with a few of his men when he's approached by a large body of unknown horsemen. And as the two bodies of men approach one another, each side growing more nervous as they don't know who the other guys are, well, Timur yells out, "Who are you and whom do you serve?" To which the unidentified horsemen respond with, "We are officers of the invincible Timur." This was risky for these guys to say because for all they know, Timur might be a Moghul officer. But thankfully for them, this was not the cause. Timur identified himself and the horsemen cheered and dismounted to kiss the ground before Timur in a sign of submission. And it turns out that these guys were Barlas warriors, thrilled to have their prince back. So as the weeks go by, the ranks of Timur and Hussein continue to grow to several hundred men, possibly as many as 2,000. Arab Shah calls this makeshift army a horde of scoundrels, but in reality this was a collection of warriors from all the tribes ready and willing to work together in order to free their land. Now, we're going to leave it at that, but before we wrap this episode up, there are two things we need to cover. First of all, this pretty much wraps up what I call Timur's desert years, as next episode we will see him return to the lush lands of Transoxiana or Mawarnar. And at the beginning of last episode and the beginning of this episode, I said that I would clarify what parts of these years historians generally agree on as fact. Well, unfortunately we don't have much, but generally people agree that Timur was outside Mawarnar during this time, between the years of roughly 1363 to 1365. They agree that he was with Hussein and that they served as mercenaries in the region of Sistan, and it's probably here, most people think, that Timur was indeed wounded. And then they started to build an army from refugees and rebels in order to take back Transoxiana and learn how to speak properly. As for all the specifics of the stories we've heard these past two episodes, we just don't really know. Different authors will say different things, but again, I included these stories because they very well might have happened, and I believe they flesh Timur out in a mostly accurate way, and they're quite fun, so I kept them in. And with that said, we need to go over one more thing. As Timur and Hussein are gathering this motley army, they of course are not the only ones preparing. Ilyas Hoja, son to the Moghul Khan and governor of Mawarnar in his father's stead, hears word that Timur and Hussein, men he presumed to be dead, are alive. And not only were they alive, but now they are returning with a host of angry warriors behind them. So Ilyas orders that the Moghul hordes and the allies of the Moghuls begin to gather. And according to one chronicle, 20,000 of them soon met the answer to Ilyas's commands. And while this number is probably an exaggeration, the point remains true that the Moghuls far outnumbered the men of Hussein and Timur. And what's more, maybe as many as 6,000 Moghuls and allied Soldus tribesmen were already bearing down on the army of Timur and Hussein without them knowing. The Moghuls had made a mistake by allowing Timur and Hussein to live those many years ago, but they were not about to make the same mistake twice. It was time to crush Mawarnar once and for all. Thank you for listening to the Timur Podcast. If you're new to the show, welcome. I am glad that you're here with us. If you want to reach out to me for any time and for any reason, feel free to do so via email at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Facebook at TimurPod or on Twitter at PodcastTimur. Or check out the show's ugly website at timurpodcast.com. I will be releasing another episode later today. That's right, 2 episodes in one day because we have to make up for all those weeks and months in which I didn't release. But today's episode, the second episode is going to be a good one, so make sure you don't miss it. We're going to take a pause from the narrative in order to look further into Timur's injuries. And there are a couple other topics that relate to Timur's injuries, and some of them are kind of crazy. But until then, stay safe, stay healthy, be good, and I'll see you right here next time on the Timur Podcast.